What would you do if the world you knew was taken from you in the stroke of a pen? If you were cast out with nothing but a pittance and the skills your father taught you? And what if you used that pittance to buy something everyone else saw as worthless? A massive iron ferry, rusting for 80 years in a dry riverbed, only to discover a secret that would change not only your life, but the soul of a forgotten place. Alara was 24 when her father's world was finally dismantled. It wasn't done with a crashing hammer or a rending tear, but with the quiet, bloodless scratch of her uncle's fountain pen. For a year after her father's passing, she had lived in a state of suspended grief, maintaining his workshop, the scent of sawdust and linseed oil, a constant, comforting eulogy. The house, her childhood home, had become a silent museum of his life, a life of quiet competence, of shaping wood and metal with knowing hands. He had been a shipwright, a man who understood the language of grain and the temper of steel, and he had taught her everything. Not the things a girl was meant to learn, her Uncle Marcus had often sniffed, but the things a person needed to know to be whole: how to read the sky, how to true a board, how to trust the unyielding logic of gravity. Marcus, her father's brother, was a man of ledgers and contracts, a man who saw the world as a series of assets to be liquidated. He had never understood his brother's calloused hands or the deep satisfaction he took in a perfectly joined dovetail. To Marcus, the workshop was a liability, and the house was prime real estate. The final meeting took place in a sterile office downtown, a room that smelled of dry paper and stale ambition. Alara sat perfectly still as he explained the legalities, his voice a monotone drone that stripped all emotion from the act of erasure. The house was sold, the contents of the workshop auctioned. Her father's tools, the extensions of his own hands, were now scattered, sold for pennies on the dollar to strangers. "This is the final settlement," Marcus said, pushing a thin envelope across the polished mahogany desk. "A gesture of goodwill, for your father's memory." He did not meet her eyes. He was looking at a point on the wall just over her shoulder, as if she were already a ghost. Alara took the envelope. She did not open it. She could feel the thinness of the check inside. It was an insult wrapped in the guise of closure. She did not cry. She did not plead. Her father had taught her that the world was often unfair, but resilience was a tool one could forge within oneself. She stood, the worn canvas satchel that held her few remaining possessions slung over her shoulder. Inside, nestled among a change of clothes and a small whetstone, was the one thing she had managed to save, the one thing she would not let them take. It was her father's plumb bob. It was solid brass, heavy in the palm, its point honed to a needle's sharpness. It was a tool for finding the true vertical, for establishing a reference against the chaos of the world. For her, it was his heart, his guidance, his unwavering truth. "Thank you, Uncle," she said, her voice clear and steady. The words were a formality, a closing of a door she had no intention of ever looking back through. She walked out of the office, out of the building and into the clamor of a city that was no longer her home. She was adrift, an outcast, possessing nothing but a paltry sum of money and a deep, quiet well of skills that the world around her had forgotten how to value. She walked for 3 days. She did not follow the main roads, crowded with wagons and the hurried, anxious faces of commerce. Instead, she followed the ghost of the old river, guided by the tattered charts her father had kept. He had taught her navigation not just by stars, but by the land itself, the gentle slope of a valley, the type of trees that grew near forgotten water sources, the subtle shift in the color of the soil. She was heading inland, away from the bustling port and into the dry lands, a place spoken of in whispers, a place of cracked earth and forgotten settlements. Her money was dwindling, spent on bread and cheese, and the occasional kindness of a farmer who would let her sleep in a hayloft. On the 4th day, she arrived in a town called Providence Reach. It was a misnomer. The reach was long gone. the town a dusty collection of buildings clinging to the edge of a vast, dry arroyo that scarred the landscape. In the county clerk's office, a place that smelled of crumbling paper and time itself, she saw it, pinned to a corkboard, amidst notices of lost cattle and upcoming town meetings, was a yellowed piece of paper, its edges curled and brittle. The ink was faded, but the words were clear enough. For sale by county tax lien, the vessel Starlight Reverie, as is, where is, located Dry Bend. Two old men standing by a pot-bellied stove chuckled as they saw her reading it. "Thinking of getting into the ferry business, miss?" one of them rasped, a grin cracking his leathery face. "You're about 80 years too late. The Titan flood of '38 moved the river 5 miles south, left the Reverie sitting in the mud like a beached whale." "Biggest pile of rust in the territory," the other added, shaking his head. "Cursed, they say. Old Captain Finch died broke and mad after he lost her. Now she's just a home for coyotes and ghosts." Alara listened, her expression unreadable. A ferry, a massive iron boat, landlocked. It was absurd, a folly, a monument to nature's indifference. But it was also something built, something real, something that had once had a purpose. She thought of the check in her pocket, the insult money. An idea, desperate and defiant, began to take root. She approached the clerk, a balding man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually bored expression. "I'd like to inquire about the Starlight Reverie," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked up from his ledger, peering at her over his spectacles. He seemed about to laugh, but something in her steady gaze stopped him. "The old ferry? Child, it's a scrap heap. The taxes on it haven't been paid since before the war. The deed is basically worthless paper." "How much?" she asked. He shrugged, running a hand over his shiny scalp. "The back taxes amount to $50. You pay that, and the county is happy to be rid of the liability." He smirked. "You got $50? Alara opened the envelope from her uncle for the first time. The check was for $55. It was all she had in the world. She endorsed it, pushed it across the counter, and laid $5 in worn bills beside it. "50 for the deed," she said, "and 5 for directions to Dry Bend." The clerk stared at the check, then at her, his smirk fading into sheer disbelief. He shook his head slowly, as if witnessing a peculiar form of madness, then stamped the back of the old deed with a heavy, final thud. He handed her the brittle document. "Follow the old riverbed west for about 2 miles, he said, his voice laced with the kind of pity reserved for the truly lost. "You can't miss it. It's the biggest mistake in the whole valley." The walk to Dry Bend was a journey through a graveyard. The arroyo was wide and silent, the ground a mosaic of cracked silt and sun-bleached stones. The skeletons of ancient cottonwoods clawed at the sky, their roots exposed and lifeless. The air was still and hot, and the only sound was the crunch of her boots on the dry earth. And then she saw it. It was worse than she had imagined, so much worse. The clerk's words had not prepared her for the sheer scale of the dereliction. The Starlight Reverie was immense, a 2-decked, side-wheel ferry, its iron hull the color of dried blood, streaked with 80 years of rust. It wasn't beached. It was buried, tilted at a drunken angle, its port side sunk deep into the compacted silt that had once been the river bottom. Its paddle wheels were skeletal remains, the wooden slats long since rotted away, leaving only the iron spokes to rust in the silent air. Paint, once white and proud, hung in peeling strips like sunburnt skin. The windows of the pilot house were shattered, dark eyes staring sightlessly at the empty sky. A wave of profound despair washed over Alara, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. This was not a vessel. It was a tomb. The laughter of the men in the clerk's office echoed in her ears. A folly. A scrap heap. Cursed. She had traded the last vestiges of her old life for a mountain of rust and rot. For a long moment she stood there, the brittle deed clutched in her hand, feeling the full weight of her foolishness. The sun beat down on her, and the silence of the dry bend seemed to mock her. But then her father's voice, a quiet memory, surfaced in her mind. "Look for the bones, Alara. Every structure, no matter how broken, has good bones. Find them, and you can rebuild anything." She took a deep breath, the hot, dusty air searing her lungs, and forced the despair down. She was a shipwright's daughter. She would assess the damage. She spent the rest of the day circling the great, silent hulk, her eyes tracing lines of stress, noting the areas of deepest decay, searching for the vessel's bones. The main deck was a treacherous landscape of rotted planks and rusted metal. The lower cargo deck was almost completely filled with hardened silt, a geological fossil of the Great Flood. But the iron hull, where it was visible, was thick plate, riveted in a way she recognized. It was built to last. The superstructure, though battered, was framed with solid oak, and in places, protected from the worst of the sun and rain, the wood was still sound beneath its gray, weathered skin. Her immediate need was shelter. Night was coming, and the temperature in the dry lands plummeted after sunset. She clambered aboard, her boots crunching on decayed wood and rusted iron flakes, and made her way toward the stern. The main passenger saloon was a wreck, its upholstered benches devoured by insects and time. But tucked beneath the overhang of the second deck were the captain's quarters. The door was gone, but the room itself was small, protected, and relatively clear of debris. It would do. She spent the next week making that small room habitable. She swept out the layers of dust and sand, patched the worst of the holes in the wall with salvaged planks, and fashioned a crude door from the remains of a tabletop. She worked methodically, her hands finding a familiar rhythm in the work. Each small act of restoration was an act of defiance against her own despair. When she had a space that was clean and dry, a place to unroll her bedroll and light a small fire in a bucket for warmth, she felt the first flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a grim, steady resolve. One afternoon, she decided to true the floor of her small sanctuary. It slanted with the tilt of the ship, and she wanted one level surface, a place of order in the surrounding chaos. She took out her father's plumb bob, its brass form cool and heavy in her hand. She tied it to a length of twine and suspended it from a beam in the ceiling. It hung perfectly still, a silent, unarguable line of pure verticality against the crooked walls of her new world. As she used it to establish a level line for her makeshift floor, her eyes fell upon the wall behind where the captain's chart table must have once stood. Something was wrong. The wall paneling, made of dark, tongue-and-groove oak, was subtly different in one section. The lines were not quite as tight. The wood grain seemed interrupted. It was an inconsistency, the kind her father had taught her to always investigate. She ran her hand over the surface, feeling for a seam. Nothing. She tapped it gently with the handle of her hammer. The sound was solid, then, in one spot, distinctly hollow. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She examined the section more closely, her fingers tracing every groove, every knot in the old wood. And then she saw it. A single bolt head, low near the floor, almost completely obscured by grime. But it wasn't iron. She scraped at it with her knife, and a faint, yellow gleam shone through the dirt. It was brass, like her plumb bob. While every other fastening on the ferry was iron, bleeding rust into the surrounding wood, this one was brass. It was deliberate. It was a secret. It took her the better part of an hour, working carefully with a small wrench and a bottle of hoarded lubricating oil, to turn the bolt. It was stiff with disuse, groaning in protest. But finally, with a low click, it gave way. It wasn't a bolt holding the panel in place. It was a lock. A section of the wall, perfectly fitted and nearly invisible, swung inward on silent brass hinges, revealing a dark, coffin-sized cavity behind it. The air that drifted out was cool and dry, smelling of old leather and contained stillness. Reaching into the darkness, her hand met the cold, smooth surface of a metal box. She pulled it out into the light. It was a sea chest, small but heavy, bound in iron and showing no signs of rust. It had been well sealed. With her pry bar and a good deal of effort, she forced the lock. The lid creaked open. Alara stared, her breath catching in her throat. The chest was filled to the brim with gold coins, sovereigns, eagles, doubloons, a glittering hoard that seemed to drink the dusty afternoon light and radiate a warm, forgotten glow. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever seen, more than her uncle had likely handled in his entire life of ledgers and contracts. It was impossible. It was a dream. But beneath the impossible weight of the gold, there was something else. She carefully lifted out a few handfuls of coins and saw it, a leather-bound logbook, wrapped in oilcloth and tied securely with a tarred cord. She unwrapped it with trembling hands. The leather was supple, the pages thick and filled with a neat, disciplined script. The first page read, "The log of the Starlight Reverie, Captain Alistair Finch, Master." She sat down on the floor of her crooked room, the gold forgotten beside her, and began to read. The logbook was more than a record of cargo and river stages. It was the captain's journal, the story of his life. Alistair Finch had been a man much like her father, a man who loved his vessel, who understood the river's moods, who believed in honest work and the strength of his own hands. He wrote of the betrayal by his business partner in St. Louis, a man who had used legal trickery to seize control of their company, leaving Finch with nothing but the oldest ferry in the fleet, the Reverie. The partner had mocked him, telling him to enjoy his retirement on the obsolete boat. Finch, however, was a keen observer of the natural world. He had seen the signs the others had missed, the shifting currents, the unusually heavy snowmelt in the mountains, the subtle changes in the riverbanks. He knew a great flood was coming, one that would not just swell the river, but change its course entirely. While others scrambled to move their vessels to high ground, Finch did the opposite. He steamed the Reverie to Dry Bend, a place he had surveyed and knew intimately, and ran her aground with deliberate, calculated precision. He was not losing his ship to the river. He was anchoring it to the land, preserving it in the one place he knew would be left high and dry. He was turning his prison into a fortress. He had hidden his life savings, the gold earned over 30 years on the river, within the secret compartment he had built, a shipwright's trick he'd designed himself. His plan was to wait out the flood and the ensuing chaos, then return to his vessel, his home, and live out his days in peace, using the money to make it a permanent dwelling. But fate had other plans. A sudden fever, likely cholera, took him in Providence Reach before he could ever return. His final entry was written in a shaky, fading hand. "The river has taken its new course," he wrote. "The Reverie is safe, my home. I fear I will not see her again. If another finds this place, one who sees not a wreck but a home, then the boat is theirs. The gold is theirs. It is not a treasure to be spent, but a tool to be used. Use it to give her life again. Build a new life from the wreckage of the old. Find the peace here that I was denied. May she be a better steward to you than the world was to me." Tears streamed down Alara's face, the first she had shed since her father's death. They were not tears of grief or self-pity, but of a profound, aching gratitude. She was not alone. 80 years ago, a man she had never met, a kindred spirit, had left her an inheritance, not just a fortune, but a purpose, a blessing. He had seen her, a future stranger, and understood her. She gently closed the logbook, a sense of profound kinship settling over her. This was not a pile of rust. This was her home, and she would honor Captain Finch's last wish. She would bring the Starlight Reverie back to life. The work began the next morning. The gold changed everything, and yet it changed nothing. Her purpose was the same, but now she had the means. She walked back to Providence Reach, her satchel heavy with a small fraction of the coins, and went to the general store. The owner was a woman named Martha, a practical, no-nonsense matriarch with kind eyes and hands accustomed to work. Alara did not explain where the money came from. She simply laid out a list: linseed oil, turpentine, oakum, caulking irons, saws, hammers, nails, screws, paint, glass, rope, food staples. Martha looked at the long list, then at the young woman before her, her clothes dusty but her eyes clear and determined. "That's a freighter's load, dear. Where am I sending it?" "To the ferry in Dry Bend," Alara said. Martha's eyebrows shot up, but she didn't laugh. She saw the seriousness in Alara's face. She saw the gold coin Alara placed on the counter. It was real. "All right," she said slowly, a look of grudging respect dawning on her face. "I'll have my boy run it out tomorrow." That was the first act of community, a transaction based not on pity, but on the undeniable reality of a paid bill. With the supplies, Alara's work became a methodical, all-consuming ritual. She started from the bones out. She spent weeks clearing the silt from the lower deck, shoveling and hauling until her muscles screamed, revealing the solid iron plates of the hull. She used wire brushes and scrapers to attack the rust, a cloud of red dust constantly surrounding her, until she was down to the bare, pitted metal. Then she painted, slathering on thick coats of rust-inhibiting primer, the smell sharp and chemical in the dry air. She was not just painting, she was sealing, protecting, preserving. Her work did not go unnoticed. A man began to appear at the edge of the arroyo in the late afternoons, a tall, sinewy figure with a long rifle and a weathered face. He never came close, just watched her from a distance, silent as the stones around him. Alara knew he was a trapper. She had seen his kind in the stories her father told. One day, after watching her single-handedly winch a massive replacement beam into place, he finally walked down into the bend. He stopped 20 feet away. "You work like a man with a purpose," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I have one," Alara replied, not stopping her work. "My name is Silas," he said. He pointed to the hills. "That white oak you're using, it'll warp in the summer heat. You need ironwood from the North Ridge. It's harder to work, but it holds true." It was not an offer of help, but a statement of fact, a gift of knowledge from one competent person to another. Alara paused, looking at him properly for the first time. She saw a deep respect in his eyes. "Thank you, Silas," she said. From then on, he would often leave a bundle of ironwood or a dressed rabbit near her camp, never asking for anything in return. Her next ally came in the form of the town blacksmith. She needed new fittings, custom bolts, and hinges forged to match the ferry's original ironwork. She drew up plans, precise and technical, and took them to Jedediah's smithy. He was a bear of a man, with arms like tree trunks and a perpetually skeptical scowl. He glanced at her drawings, grunted, and named a high price, expecting her to leave. Instead, Alara looked him in the eye. "Your price is fair," she said, "but this drawing specifies a Rockwell hardness of 45 for the hinge pins. Can you guarantee that temper? I don't want them shearing under load." Jedediah's scowl vanished, replaced by a look of stunned surprise. This waif of a girl was talking about the metallurgy of his craft. He took the drawings again, studying them with new respect. He saw the knowledge in the lines, the understanding of shear and tensile strength. "I can," he grumbled, a hint of pride in his voice. "I'll do it." He became her most vital resource, a man who could breathe life back into metal, and he took a fierce, protective pride in the restoration of the reverie. Through Martha, Silas, and Jedediah, the story of the strange young woman rebuilding the ghost ferry spread through the valley. The mockery turned to curiosity, and then to a quiet, deep-seated respect. People saw the results. They saw the shattered windows of the pilot house replaced with new glass that caught the morning sun. They saw the rotting deck planks replaced with a solid, beautiful new surface of oiled ironwood. They saw a thin curl of smoke rising from a newly installed chimney stack, a sign of life, of a hearth, of a home. The county clerk, the man who had sold her the deed, eventually drove his buggy out to Dry Bend, his curiosity having gotten the better of him. He stood at the edge of the arroyo, his jaw slack. The tilted, rusted hulk he remembered was being transformed. The upper decks were painted a crisp white, the trim a deep forest green. Brass fittings, polished to a high shine, gleamed in the sun. It was no longer a wreck. It was a structure, proud and defiant, rising from its grave. Jedediah was there that day, delivering a new anchor chain. He saw the clerk and just grinned, a slow, knowing smile. The clerk got back in his buggy without a word and drove away, the public mockery silenced by the undeniable truth of Alara's labor. 1 year after her arrival, as autumn painted the sparse foliage of the valley in shades of gold and rust, the sky turned a bruised, ominous purple. The wind began to howl, a low moan that rattled the new window panes of the ferry. Silas appeared at her door, his face grim. "Flash flood, Alara," he said. "A big one, the kind we only see every 20 years. The wash will run deep tonight." Alara secured her home, checking the lines she and Jedediah had set deep into the bedrock, anchoring the ferry to the land even more securely. The rain began, a torrential downpour that turned the dry earth to mud in minutes. Soon a low roar echoed from up the canyon. A trickle of water in the arroyo became a stream, then a muddy, churning river, rising with terrifying speed. The Starlight Reverie, for the first time in 80 years, had water lapping at its hull. But it was high and safe, an island of stability in the raging chaos. Just after midnight, through the roar of the water, she heard a scream. Peering from the pilot house, her lantern cutting through the sheeting rain, she saw it. A wagon, caught in the torrent, was breaking apart. A family, a man, a woman, and 2 small children, clung desperately to a rocky outcrop in the middle of the wash, the water rising around them. They were new homesteaders, people who didn't know the terrible power of the dry river. Without a second thought, Alara went to work. She and Jedediah had salvaged and re-spooled the ferry's old steel winch cables. With Silas's help, she fired a line-throwing gun, a piece of the ferry's original safety equipment she had painstakingly restored, across the torrent. The line landed near the stranded family. With shouted instructions carried on the wind, she showed the man how to secure it. For the next hour, using the powerful, hand-cranked winch, she, Silas, and Jedediah, who had arrived to help, hauled the family to safety, one by one, across the raging water and onto the solid deck of the ferry. She brought the shivering, terrified family into her warm, dry galley, wrapped the children in blankets, and gave them hot soup. The homesteaders looked around at the clean, orderly interior, the warm glow of the lamps, the solid strength of the vessel that had saved them. The ferry, once a symbol of abandonment, had become an ark. It had saved them. In that moment, Alara was no longer an outsider. She was the heart of this place, the steward of the Dry Bend. In the quiet days that followed the flood, as the water receded and the community helped the homesteaders rebuild, Alara found Captain Finch's logbook again. He had mentioned a younger sister, Mary, from whom he had been estranged after the betrayal. A final, loose note in the back of the book spoke of his regret, and that she had married a farmer and moved west. Driven by a need to close the circle, Alara used some of the gold and Martha's network of contacts to find what became of Mary. She discovered her great-grandchildren, a family of struggling farmers in the next state, their land plagued by drought. She sent them a significant portion of the gold, anonymously, with a note simply saying it was a debt repaid from the river. She had fulfilled the captain's legacy, righting a historical wrong and bringing a measure of peace to his memory. The seasons turned. The Starlight Reverie was no longer a project. It was a home. A garden flourished in the rich soil the flood had deposited. Silas taught her which plants would thrive. Jedediah built her a small, perfect forge on the lower deck. Martha's freight wagon became a regular visitor. The ferry was a landmark, a beacon, a place of safety and quiet strength. One cool, clear evening, Elara stood in the pilot house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of rose and violet. The dry bend below was green with new life. Below, on the main deck, Silas and Jedediah sat sharing a quiet cup of coffee with her, their presence a comfortable, unspoken testament to the community she had forged. She was not alone. She had found her harbor in the most unlikely of places. On the polished surface of the old chart table, a beam of the last light caught two objects, sitting side by side. One was her father's plumb bob, its brass body heavy and true, a symbol of the skill and resilience he had given her. The other was the compass from Captain Alistair Finch's sea chest, its needle pointing faithfully north, a symbol of the purpose and fortune he had bequeathed her. The two inheritances, one of craft and one of circumstance, were now one. She looked out at the vast, quiet landscape, her heart full of a deep, peaceful contentment. Her uncle had cast her out with an insult, a sum meant to signify her worthlessness. With it, she had bought a ruin that everyone mocked. But her father had given her the true inheritance, hands that knew how to build, a mind that knew how to solve, and a spirit that refused to be broken. The gold had been a tool, nothing more. The real treasure was the work itself, the slow, methodical act of creating a home from a wreck, a life from a loss. The $50 she had paid to a dismissive clerk for a pile of rust and ghosts had been, without a doubt, the best money she ever spent.